how to sew the Flower Shop block of the month, July Flowers. This is the Log Cabin Patchwork Cushion. This is part of the Flower Shop block of the month, which is a series of 12 panels which make the Flower Shop quilt at the end. Cutting out. Take the fabric panel and you will see all the pieces are on the panel and they're labelled. There's the main flower display and the informal flowers below it. You can use either for the front of your cushion. Now you can see all the pieces that are used for the log cabin. The same fabric is used for 2 pieces, so you've got strip 9 and 10 and all the different ones that are labelled. You've got the cushion upper back and the lower back as well. And also on the panel are 2 charm squares and a gift tag if you want to make those to match. Now cut out the panel that you want to use for the front of the cushion. The measurements are in the instructions. Then cut around all the different strips and pin the labels to them. It's important when making piecing log cabin patchwork that the fabric pieces are cut accurately. So we've included fabric pieces larger than you need them so that you can trim them down to size. So make sure you label everything before you start trimming. To start with, take strip 1 and 2. Now to get a nice neat edge on the side, remove the label to start with, but keep that, you'll need that in a moment. Take your rotary cutting ruler and just trim off the very edge of the long side, just to get a nice straight edge. The pieces are bigger than you actually need, so there's plenty of room to be able to trim this off. Now start by cutting this into 2 strips measuring 1.5 inches in width. And cut it across the whole length. So cut 1 strip and place it to one side, and then cut another strip measuring 1.5 inches in width. Now you need to trim these strips to the right length. The lengths are all given in the instructions and there are different lengths for each strip. So lay your piece horizontally, and again, to get a nice neat edge, if you lay the long length along one of the lines on your cutting mat, then just trim off the edge. Now this piece is going to be strip 1, and you'll see in the instructions that you need to cut this 10.5 inches in length. So lay your ruler on top, line up the 10.5 inch mark on the left hand side, and then trim it on the right. Put that to one side. Now take the other strip that you cut earlier and again lay it horizontally in line with the line on your cutting mat and then trim off the end. I'm just using a shorter ruler for this just because it's easier, but you can use the longer one if you prefer. Now for strip 2, you'll see in the instructions that you need to cut this 11.5 inches in length. So line up the 11.5 inch mark on the left hand side and then trim it on the right hand side so that strip 2 is now 11.5 inches in length. Now it's important that you remember which is which. So if you take the label that you cut off, you can just cut that in half. So I cut one so it said strip 1 and pin that to that strip. And then take the other piece that says and 2, and that'll just help you to remember when you're assembling the whole thing to put them all together in order. I keep them piled in order because it makes it easier during assembly. Now you can see I've cut all of the other strips in the same way. You can see I've labelled them 3 and 4, 5 and 6 and 7. If you do that, have a look at the instructions. It will tell you because all the strips are different lengths and it's important that you cut accurately at this stage. Pile them up in order and it will make it a lot easier during assembly because you can just pick up them from the pile in order as you sew them in place. Piecing the log cabin. Take the centre square that you cut earlier and then start by taking strip 1 and placing it right sides facing along the top edge. Make sure that you match up the raw edges and the corners. This is why you can see it was important to cut your strips accurately to length. It makes piecing so much easier and you've got no seam matching or trimming afterwards. So pin it together across the top edge and then stitch into place using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once this is done, you need to press the seams. So start by pressing across the seam just to set the seam, as this will help it to lie flatter. And then fold it so that the seam allowance is facing towards the strip. When you press all of the pieces, the seam allowances should always be facing outwards towards the strip you've just pieced. You'll get a nice, neat finish this way. Now, take strip 2. This is where you can see it's important that you labelled them all earlier. And this needs to be sewn down the right-hand side. Place it right sides facing on top. Now turn it over, because it's easier when you're sewing 2 pieces together to sew with the seam uppermost. This will make sure that when you sew over the seam, you keep it lying flat and it doesn't get twisted. There's no seam matching at all here, so just sew it together across the top. When that's done, turn it over and press it towards the strip. So that's pieces 1 and 2 now attached. Turn it round and take strip 3. Place that along the bottom edge, because we're going to be working clockwise all the time. Place this right sides facing on top. Again, turn it over so that the seamed side is uppermost. And pin it together at one end. Then pin it together at the other end. By pinning either end first before you pin in the centre, it helps to keep the corners matched up so that it fits exactly. Give it a little pull, ease it out, make sure the raw edges are matching up, and then pin it in the centre. Now stitch it together along this edge. Press the seam towards the strip. Now turn it so it's facing the right way up again, and take strip 4, and that's going to be sewn to the left hand side, because we're always going to be working round this way. Place it right sides facing on top. Turn it over so that the seamed side is uppermost and pin it into place. When you stitch on over these seams, just make sure that the seams are always laying in the direction that you've pressed them and they don't get twisted. Now sew this into place all the way along. And then press the seam towards the strip. So now you've got the first 4 strips attached to the centre panel. So take strip 5 and sew that together across the top. And then when you've done that, sew strip 6 down the sides. Always sew and press, one at a time. I'm just showing you this in pairs. Strip 7 goes across the bottom and strip 8 goes up the left-hand side. Then take strip 9, that goes across the top, sew that in place, then sew strip 10 down the right-hand side. Now take strip 11 and sew that across the bottom, and sew strip 12 up the left-hand side. You can see now how all the pinks are on the right and all the purples are on the left. That gives the log cabin effect. Sew strip 13 across the top, and sew strip 14 down the right-hand side. Now take strip 15, sew that one across the bottom, and sew strip 16 up the left-hand side. Now the log cabin cushion front is complete. Quilting the cushion top. Take your fusible wadding and lay it with the glue side up. If you're using non-fusible, just lay it down flat. Now place your pieced log cabin cushion top centrally on top of the wadding and smooth it out with your hand so it's nice and flat and it's straight. If you're using fusible wadding, press it into the place. Follow the manufacturer's instructions for doing that, but I find if you hold the iron without the steam for a few seconds in each place, it will fuse it into place. If you're using non-fusible, then just tack it into place. Now I'm going to quilt it. I quilted my cushion using a cross-hatch design, and I marked this onto the cushion front using a heat erasable pen so that I could stitch over the lines, but you can use whatever method you prefer. Once that's done, stitch over all the lines using a slightly longer quilting stitch, and then if you've used a heat erasable pen, take your iron and press it all over, and that will remove the lines. Make sure they're all removed so that you can't see them anymore, and then you've got a beautifully quilted top. But you can use whatever method you like or whatever pattern. Once you've done that, you now need to trim the wadding so that it's level with the edge of the cushion top. So place your quilted top on your cutting mat and take your ruler, and making sure it's all nice and straight. I make sure that the 1¼ of an inch edge is level with the seam. If you do that all the way along, then you'll make sure that outer strip is the right width. You may have a little bit of extra wadding, but that will be lost when you sew the cushion back into place. But if you line up the 1¼ inch mark, you'll have a nice straight edge. So trim it all the way round, and you've finished quilting your cushion top nice and neat. Making the cushion back. Take the cushion upper back and the cushion lower back and place them right sides facing, so that the bottom long edge of the cushion upper back and the top long edge of the cushion lower back are together. Then pin them together along this edge, matching raw edges. They're both exactly the same size, so this will be easy to do. So pin it together at either end, and then in a few places along the length. Now measure 2 inches from the left-hand side and mark this. This is going to be the outer seam, so that the zip is inserted not right up to the edges, just within. It helps to get a neater finish. And measure 2 inches in from the right hand edge. Now we're going to sew these together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That's really important because the ends of the zip will be caught better. Use a normal stitch length for the outer seams and the longest stitch length, a tacking stitch, between those seams. So open it up and you can press the seam open now. So the centre seam between the 2 inches is using the longer stitch, and the outer bits are using your normal stitch length. You can see here I've used the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once you've pressed that open and flat, take your zip. The zip is longer than it needs to be because it's easier to insert it if you use a longer zip and then trim it afterwards. So just mark where the end of that seam is, and make sure that you place your zip so that it extends beyond that. If you place your zip centrally along, I've listed in the ingredients what length zip you need. Now roll the zip down, making sure that the teeth lie exactly on top of that tacked seam. So just roll it down, making sure the zip teeth lie on top, and then pin it into place. If you're using a normal dressmaking zip, you'll actually find that the edge of the zip tape sits on the edge of the seam allowance, but it's always worth checking that you roll the teeth down so they sit on top of the seam, and then pin it into place all the way along. Then pin it together along the bottom. Now we're going to move these pins in a minute, so they don't have to be facing the right way at this point because we'll be taking them out. It's easier to get the zip placed exactly in the right place by pinning from the wrong side, but you'll get a neater finish by sewing from the right side. So we're going to do some double pinning here. It takes a little bit of extra time, but it really is worth the effort to get a neatly inserted zip. Pin the ends of the zip tape too. Now turn it over to the right side and re-pin. I usually pin between the pins I've placed on the wrong side just because it's easier to get them in. So pin the zip through all the layers. Make sure that you catch the zip in this as well. So you now know that the zip is in the right place, so it's easy to do this pinning. And pin the end of the zip tape, that just keeps it straight. Turn it around and then pin on the other side. By turning it around and pinning, it means that the pins are facing the right direction, so they're much easier to take out whilst you're sewing the zip into place. So you can see the end of the zip tape extends outside, but we'll cut that off later. So continue pinning all the way round. So the zip is nice and securely in place. Now turn it back over to the wrong side and you can now take out all the pins. Now turn it back over and you now just need to mark with a pin where the ends of those seams were, the ones that you stitched 2 inches, because you're going to stitch just outside these points. So mark that either end. If you pull the seam apart very gently, you can see where the tacking stitches start. And then you're going to sew the zip into place using a zip foot about 1/4 inch away from the seam. But before you do that, you are going to have to move the zip slider, so it's best to open it a little bit before you start. So I usually open it just about 1/4 or 1/3 of the way along and then pin the ends of the zip tape back into place. So sew it together all the way around. When you reach the slider, raise the zipper foot, keeping the needle down, move the slider and then sew back again. So you can see I've sewn in a rectangle all the way around the edge. Now you need to undo those tacking stitches, not the side seams, just the tacking stitches. If you take your seam ripper, a little tip here is if you have the ball point, the little red plastic end facing downwards, you're less likely to cut the fabric as you're seam ripping, just because of the angle of the blade. So when you do your seam ripping, always have that ball point facing downwards. Now you need to carefully remove all of those tacking stitches. So just go all the way along, pulling out the tacking stitches, all the loose ends, just so you get a neat finish. So you can see now that you've got a nice, neatly inserted zip that's well away from the side seams, but big enough to get the cushion pad in. Now trim the ends of the zip so they're about 1 inch outside of the sewing. That means the ends of the zip won't be caught in the side seams when you put the cushion front on, but there's enough so that it doesn't get pulled out. So about 1 inch is okay. Now if you turn it back over, turn it the right way up, you can see that you've now got a neatly inserted zip in the centre of your cushion back. Assembling the cushion. Take your cushion back and open the zip to halfway. Now take the quilted cushion front and place it right sides facing on top. You'll notice that the cushion back is a little bigger than the cushion front, and we've done this purposefully because it's easier to make sure that it's in the right place, because sometimes when you quilt the cushion front it can end up a little bigger or smaller, so it's easier if the cushion back is just a little bit bigger and then you can trim it afterwards. So place it centrally and pin the front to the back all the way round. Because the zip is placed 2 inches in from either end, you won't have any issues with sewing through the zip teeth itself. So make sure as you're pinning it all the way around that you just smooth it out so that the front and the back are both lying nice and flat. Now we're going to go back to our 1/4 inch seam allowance here. It's only the zip that was inserted with a 1/2 inch. This will be sewn into place with your usual 1/4 inch. Sew it together all the way around, no turning gap needed because we've got the zip on the cushion back. Once that's done, you can now trim the cushion back so it's exactly the same size as the cushion front. This helps to just reduce any extra bulk that's inside and you'll get a neater finish. So trim it together all the way round and then snip off the corners just to remove the bulk at these points. But just take care not to cut into the stitching. Now once that's done, turn the whole cushion cover right sides out. If you push your fingers into the corners and push them out first, it's a little bit easier. And turn it right sides out through the zip. And then go back into all the corners and the edges just to push everything out so it's nice and neat. Now do up the zip and roll it between your fingers so that those seams are lying right on the edge all the way round, and give it a good press. Now we're going to create an edging to the cushion, which you don't have to do, but it just gives it like a nice, almost like a bound edge. We're going to sew along the line of the outside strips. So to keep this nice and flat, place pins in the centre of the strips that are the next one in from the outer ones. As you're doing this, just keep smoothing it to make sure the fabric on the cushion back is lying flat, so that when you pin through the front and the back, everything's lying flat. So you can see I'm pinning through the centre of the strip that's the second one in from the edge. Move the zip so it's in the centre, so it's well out of the way of this stitching, otherwise your sewing machine foot might just hit the edge of the zip slider. But because you've inserted the zip 2 inches in from the end, you won't be sewing through any of the zip teeth. So double check all the time that the cushion back is lying nice and flat. And pin it together all the way round through that strip that's the second one in from the edge. Now using a slightly longer stitch, at 3 is about right, stitch right on top of the seam that's between the first and the second strip in from the edge, as I'm showing you here. You'll sew through the cushion front and the cushion back at the same time. And sew all the way round. So you can see here that gives almost a nice sort of puffy edge, like an Oxford edge, to the edge of your cushion, which just gives it a nice finish. So once that's done, you can put your cushion pad inside and your beautiful log cabin cushion is now finished and ready to show off.